Good morning, everybody. I am Dr. Wyan, and today's discussion is about Socrates. So let's get started. Let's share the slideshow and talk about Socrates. Get the slideshow going here. See where to put these captions. All right. So Socrates. Philosophy often, when we start discussing philosophy, we often start with Socrates. He isn't the first person we can call a philosopher, but he's a good starting point. And you'll see why as we go through that. So who was Socrates and why is he important? Socrates was born in 469 BC, so about 2,500 years ago, almost 2,500 years ago. His mother was a midwife or a doula. She helped women give birth. His father was a stone cutter. So he was what you might call a middle-class person. His original claim to fame in the Athens of his day, Athens was one of the major city-states of ancient Greece, was to be a soldier in the Peloponnesian War against Sparta. Apparently a very good soldier, very great in battle, very fierce in battle, very, very brave in battle. But he retired from the military about the age of 40 and practiced what he called philosophy. He didn't coin the term, but he's one of the first to use it extremely consistently. And what philosophy means in Greek is love of wisdom. So philosophy means love of wisdom. A philosopher is somebody who loves wisdom. He was an odd, kind of eccentric character. He roamed around Athens for about 30 years until he was executed at the age of 70 by the Athenian court. More of that soon. And he was, he didn't have a regular job. He had income. He lived, I think, on a military pension, but he didn't have a regular job or career. He never wore any shoes and just running around barefoot, any sandals really, because they wore sandals. His hair was kind of unkempt. His beard was kind of untidy. His tunic was a bit of a mess. And he's often described as quite ugly, which is rather mean. But Athenians were obsessed with physical beauty. And so he's often described as kind of a bad looking guy. Unfair, unfortunate, but he's often just seen as a weird guy by people who don't like him. Some of his fans describe him this way too, but they kind of make a virtue out of his weirdness. It's part of why he's so great. He's just so different. He is sentenced to death by the Athenian court and executed in the year 390 BC at the age of 70. And so we don't know a whole ton much more about him than that because he didn't write anything himself. His writings come down to us from his followers. A few of them wrote about them. We have several works of two guys, Plato and Xenophon, who knew him and wrote about him. But ancient writers are not like modern historians, biographers, reporters. They aren't particularly concerned with, hey, this is the way it really happened. They'll fudge facts and invent things, and they're not. It's not just the facts, It's they're freer with facts than we are. So it's not always clear what exactly happened and what the writer is changing with ancient writers. Nevertheless, there's a kind of a widespread agreement on some basic facts of what he was like. And the closest we can probably get to the historical Socrates is what you find in the earliest writings of his student, Plato. Plato was a great philosopher in his own right. And so in Plato, you get a lot of use of the figure of Socrates as a character. And in Plato's more mature writings, his later writings, this character is often really just speaking the philosophy of Plato. But in his earliest writings, although it's not word for word what happened, it's still pretty close probably to what Socrates was like and what he actually said and did, even if it's not an exact transcript. So the writing I'm going to talk about is called the Apology by Socrates' student, Plato. Again, Plato, great philosopher on his own. More about him in later talks. Plato lived from 428 to 348, so he died at the age of 80. And about 20 years after the death of Socrates, so about 379 BC, he wrote called the Apology, which comes from a Greek word apologia, which means defense. And the apology just means not an I'm sorry, but a defense. It's the defense of Socrates. It's an account of the trial of Socrates offered by Plato. Now, they didn't have court reporters, they didn't have any way to record this. So Plato is writing this based on his memory. And what it is, it's Socrates' speech at his defense. He is writing to you and he's saying, look, this is what Socrates said. It can't be really the word for word what Socrates said. There's no way Plato remembered this word for word 20 years later. Memory doesn't work like that. So Plato is giving you a speech that he has written, but you can be pretty sure that, look, Socrates said something similar. Usually what happens with ancient writers is they'll remember the key points, the main ideas, the witty one-liners, and they'll invent a speech. Right? So is this exactly what Socrates said at his trial? Almost certainly not. Is it the gist of the argument and some of his key points? Probably so. And the image of Socrates that appears in the Apology is, most scholars agree, probably pretty accurate. So think of it that way. Okay, so the setting is in Athens in the court in 399. You have 70-year-old Socrates as the protagonist, and you have these three accusers. These accusers are Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon. Those are your three accusers, and they are the three guys that have brought charges against Socrates. We'll talk briefly about those charges in a second. And they say, look, Socrates is a terrible guy, and you should execute him. If you read Plato, you're kind of confused about why these guys would bring charges. It doesn't seem like there's any legitimate reason. And indeed, it doesn't seem to me to be fair that Socrates was tried and executed on the charges that were brought against him. But, this was a period of political turmoil in Athens. There's a long story there. We don't need to get into it. There has been some excellent work done on this. There was a whole political climate Socrates found himself on the wrong side of. And so he largely suffered for complex political reasons that are very interesting, but they're beyond the scope of our talk. So we'll set aside them, and we'll just sort of go through the Apology real quick. And by looking at the Apology, what we will do is we'll basically get an image of who Socrates was, what he believed, what his values were, and what his method of teaching was. And that's a good place to start when one gets introduced to philosophy. So let's do that. So here you can see Socrates on trial, and a trial in ancient Athens is interesting. No lawyers, no judges. It's not like a courtroom. It's like in a little amphitheater. And you just have the accusers speak their charges, and then you have the person defend themselves. No attorneys. There isn't a judge. There's a jury of 501 people picked by lot, picked that day, and there you are, right? And that's the way it goes, and a simple majority decides the case. So Socrates' accusers, when the Apology starts, have just spoken. Plato doesn't tell us what they've said. Socrates, in responding to them, will sum it up here and there, but Plato doesn't give their speeches. He just starts with Socrates replying, and Socrates says, "Look, here's what they've charged me with. They say I'm guilty of corrupting the youth of Athens and of impiety." In other words, he's a bad influence on young people, particularly young men. That's what they mean by corrupting the youth. He's taught them bad ideas, dangerous ideas, and impiety. Presumably, impiety is some of the bad ideas he's taught them. And what impiety means here is that Socrates has inappropriate or incorrect religious beliefs. He doesn't believe the right things about the gods, the Greek gods. That's the charges. And he says, Socrates kind of plays with this a little bit. And he says, well, what makes them think that is what I do? It has to do with the fact that for decades now, there's been a preconception of who I am. There's been a prejudice about me, a prejudice about who Socrates is, what I do, and so on. And this prejudice says that I belong to two groups of people. Now, both these groups of people existed for centuries, really, at least decades in one case, probably centuries in the other, before Socrates, and they were well-known groups of thinkers, sophists and students of nature. Students of nature are in some ways close to what we call scientists, but they don't have instruments, they don't have say experiments, so not quite what we mean by scientists. Students of nature were people who would try to figure out what the universe was made of, how things got here, right? How did the world come to be? How do things happen? What is stuff ultimately made of? Things like that. Now, they had various different theories, but these theories were not really thought out scientific theories. They were kind of guesses, educated guesses, some of them very clever. And they would often run into trouble because they would give natural explanations for things rather than religious ones, or, they wouldn't explain in terms of Greek mythology how things work. So thunder wasn't described to Zeus. The sun wasn't a god riding the sky in his chariot. They would say the sun's a ball of fire, or thunder is something clouds do. They would have natural explanations rather than supernatural or mythical ones. And so they were considered to be irreligious by some parties. And Socrates is thought to be one of these guys, offering mechanical, natural explanations rather than religious ones. He's also thought to be a sophist. And these were groups of traveling teachers that would go all over Greece, all the different city-states, Athens, Crete, Sparta, wherever, Thebes. And they would charge a fee, and they would teach an art they called rhetoric, which is an art of argument, where they would teach you how to persuade people that you were right. And why was that important? Well, if you won arguments, you could achieve positions of influence. You can become powerful, you can become successful, you could win political influence and power. And so they taught people this art of argumentation, and at least the reputation was that they didn't care whether you were right. They just cared whether you won the arguments. They didn't care about truth. They just cared about convincing people. And so they were not just teaching persuasion, but they were teaching manipulation. Whether that's fair to this group as a whole, I don't know. Scholars debate it, but that was a perception people had. And so people thought Socrates was part of both of these groups. It was a common view of Socrates and what he was. And that's how they thought of him. That's what they thought Socrates was. They thought he was this kind of a person. That's how this was seen. And so he argues, first off in his trial, that's why you think I'm corrupting the young and I'm impious. I have bad religious beliefs because you think I'm a sophist, teaching them to manipulate people and win arguments, whether they're have the truth on their side or not, and that I'm this godless student of nature who doesn't care. So this is what they think. And he says, no, I'm neither of these things, and I can prove it. He says, anybody here, and you get the 501 jury, and you get almost everybody important in Athens there watching this trial, everybody who knows Socrates and knows about him. And he asked everybody there. He says, has anybody heard me talking about this? Has anybody heard such a thing? And they say, no, we haven't. Or better, they don't say anything. And so nobody can say that he's claimed any of the things students of nature claim. He hasn't read a book, he hasn't given a lecture, he hasn't claimed these things. He's clearly not a student of nature. He also makes an argument that he's not a sophist on the grounds that they go from town to town charging money, and they're very rich. He's quite poor. He doesn't even own a pair of shoes. At least doesn't wear one. And he doesn't travel from town to town. He just stays in Athens. And he makes it quite clear they claim to have a special knowledge. They claim to be able to teach an art of persuasion. He doesn't claim this. He doesn't claim to have any special knowledge. He doesn't claim to be a wise person. That's what the word sophist means, a wise person. He doesn't claim to be this at all. And in fact, whenever you read about Socrates, what you end up reading is that Socrates is always, when he's encountering sophists, trying to debate them. He seems to be quite opposed to them. So he really isn't either of these things. And he makes a pretty convincing case that the charges that see him as corrupting young people and being irreligious, being anti-religious, depend upon seeing him as these two things, and he's not. But he does say at this point, but nevertheless, I must be here for a reason. Obviously, there's something different about me, and this something different is why I must be here. I can't just be a regular guy doing regular things. And he says, that's a fair point. I must do something different. So now I'm going to explain what it is I actually do, which has given people this misperception of me. There is something I do, and it is unusual. And this is what's irritated people. All right, so let's see what he does. So in response to what he really is up to, he tells a story. He says, I have to go back 30 years and tell you about my friend Chaerephon. Now, Chaerephon 30 years ago got it into his head that I was a particularly wise person. I don't know why he thought this, because I'm not all that wise, Socrates says. But he went to the Oracle of Delphi. Now, what's the Oracle of Delphi? Okay, well, here's the Oracle of Delphi. The Oracle of Delphi is supposed to receive messages from the god Apollo. You have this priestess, she's in the temple, and the temple is over a volcanic site where it's near a volcano, where these fumes come up from the ground. And she sits near the fumes, and she gets a vision from Apollo or a message from Apollo, and she conveys it in answer to questions from people. Nearly everyone in ancient Greece believed in this oracle, and they often went to the oracle with questions, and the oracle answered them quite regularly. The belief in the oracle was widespread in Greece and into Roman times as well. So it was very profoundly believed in. And so Chaerephon goes to the oracle and asks the oracle, is anyone wiser than Socrates? Socrates says, no. I'm sorry, not Socrates. The oracle says, no. No one is wiser than Socrates. And this is Apollo. It's supposed to be Apollo talking to God. And Chaerephon is told nobody is wiser than Socrates. It's worded very specifically. Nobody is wiser than Socrates. And Chaerephon comes back, tells Socrates, and Socrates is puzzled. He says, what can the oracle possibly mean? I know that I'm not particularly wise. So how can the oracle say nobody's wiser than me? And then he says something very interesting. He says, I know the oracle must be telling the truth because the oracle speaks on behalf of Apollo, which tells you right away that Socrates does believe in the Greek gods. And if you read everything we know about Socrates, he clearly does. Right? So the idea that he's teaching false religious beliefs is a little weird to put him on trial for. He clearly does believe in the Greek gods. It's rather clear that he does. Okay. So keep that in mind. But the Oracle at Delphi was often known for giving a kind of mixed answer, or an answer that's more of a riddle or a puzzle that you have to figure out, which, by the way, is a good way to stay in business if you are an oracle. And so Socrates assumes this is a riddle. There really is somebody wiser than him, but there's kind of a hidden meaning in the oracle's answer. So he decides what he needs to do is go find somebody who actually is wiser than him, bring that person back to the oracle, and then say, you said I was so wise, but this person is wiser. What's up? So what does he do? He does exactly what he thinks he's supposed to do. He goes out and he tries to find a person who is particularly wise. So he finds a man with a high reputation for wisdom. He says, this is one of our famous politicians at the time. And I thought, surely this person will be extraordinarily wise. And so he starts asking him questions. Now, the questions that Socrates think pertain to wisdom are questions of what we call ethics, right? Ethics, questions of right and wrong, questions of what it is to be a good person. So he's not just asking people any old questions. He's asking, what's a good person? What's a fair society? How should I live? Things like that. So he's always going to be asking ethical questions. And he starts asking the guy, what do you think justice is? Or what is it to be a good person? How does that work? That's what Socrates is up to. And it turns out after talking to this guy for a little bit, the Socrates is convinced that the guy doesn't know. He thinks he doesn't know either, but he sees a difference between him and this guy he's talking to. And he realizes, oh, the difference between him and me is this. He's convinced he knows the answers to these questions. He's absolutely sure he knows what justice is, or what a good person is, or how we should live. He's convinced he knows the answers. I know that I don't. I don't know for sure what a good person is, or what justice is, or how we should live. I have some ideas. I think some ideas are probably better than others, but I don't know for sure. He thinks he knows for sure. So I was wiser than this man in one respect, and really one respect only. He thought he knew whereas I know that I don't know. Knowing that you don't know, that's a kind of wisdom. And in that way, Socrates says, I'm wiser than this man. I know that I don't know. He doesn't realize that he doesn't know. And the guy doesn't respond well when Socrates points this out to him. And this happens again and again. He goes to poets and politicians and regular working people, and he realizes almost everybody has this problem. They think they know the answers to these questions. They think they know what right and wrong is without flaw. They think they understand exactly what morality is and what a good person is. They don't really have any doubts that they know what's right. He has doubts. He knows he doesn't know. And finally, he realizes, oh, I get it. It's not that I have any great wisdom or I know the answers to things. The reason that nobody is wiser than Socrates is because I'm as wise as human beings can be. The wisest a human being can be is to know that we don't know. We don't know the answers to ethical questions, big ethical questions, about how to live our lives with absolute certainty. We can't be sure. Right? Wisdom is knowing you don't know that. Ignorance is thinking you know when you don't. Most people think they know when they don't. But me, Socrates, I know that I don't know. Anyone could be as wise as Socrates. No one can be any wiser than that, because we can't know these things with certainty. Most people, unfortunately, don't realize that and think they know. That's what the oracle was saying. And so he realizes, but now I know why my name was given, because not only did I know that, the god Apollo has a mission for me. Apollo wants me to help people to realize this. So he begins to say, Apollo sent me on a mission. So he's on trial for not believing properly in the Greek gods, but he thinks the Greek gods sent him on a mission. Which, by the way, a normal thing to believe if you get a message from the oracle in ancient Greece. It's not a crazy belief. It's something you might realistically interpret the oracle to mean that you have a mission. That's not uncommon in ancient Greece. So he says, the oracle must want me to teach my fellow Athenians that they don't know what they think they know. And so for 30 years, this is what he did. That was his major pursuit. He got up at dawn. He would go to the agora, the public marketplace. They had an area there set up where people would have a free speech area where they would have debates. So he's not just going to bother people, right? He's not at all. He's going to a place where people want to have discussions, and he's going there to discuss things, and he's asking people questions. So they're having discussions about what justice is, or goodness, or the right kind of political society, all these big moral, political, ethical questions. And Socrates is saying, you think you know the answers to this? I'm not so sure. What about this? And he's admitting, look, I don't know the answers either, but here's where I see flaws with your answers. Let's try to rethink this. And this is what he would do every day for 30 years. A lot of people thought this was great, and he had some followers who mimicked his style. Many other people thought he was annoying. Others thought he was dangerous for questioning traditional Athenian values. And in a time of political turmoil, those who thought he was dangerous, these are the ones that eventually put him on trial. Right? Because if he thought that we didn't know what we thought we knew, he'd be questioning the traditional values of those in charge, which he did. So that's where he was considered to be dangerous, and perhaps to be leading the young astray. That's basically how that happened. Now, he had a mantra, by the way, about why we should do this. Why should we question all our values and rethink them? Well, his claim was that the unexamined life is not worth living. This is kind of the big quote for Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. What does that mean? The unexamined life is not worth living. Well, here's what it means. An unexamined life is where you simply accept that the values you're taught to believe in are true, and the beliefs you're given are unquestioned. But the unexamined life is a life where the values you're taught, you just accept, and the beliefs you're given, you don't question. So he thinks that's not a good way to go about your life, and here's why. So let's consider a tale of two lives. The unexamined life is a life in which you passively accept the beliefs and values you're taught. Right? You passively accept them. That means you just don't question them. This is what you were taught to believe and to value, and you just accept it as true. And for Socrates, well, it's not worth living because these beliefs can be harmful to you and harmful to others. You can believe or value things that tell you not only things that are wrong, but things that are hurtful. A classic example might be, if you're raised in a cult that tells you that you must sacrifice everything you believe for the dear leader, or certain beauty standards, right? Only if you look like this are you beautiful, or only if you have this kind of job or own this kind of home are you successful. Those are beliefs that you might internalize from the broader culture and think are true, and you don't fit the mold, and you have self-esteem issues because of it. Harmful to others, just think of a number of terrible historical beliefs, racist beliefs, sexist beliefs, historically accepting things like slavery or segregation as just natural and fine, which a number of people did. This is the way we were raised. We were raised to believe in that slavery is okay, so we just accept it. No, right? These are terrible things. Slavery, sexism, segregation, these things are bad. They hurt people. And the unexamined life is a life in which you don't question those things. And so that's why the unexamined life is not worth living. The examined life, on the other hand, is a life in which you actively, critically, and independently examine and question your beliefs. A life in which you decide on the basis of good or bad reasons to accept or reject certain beliefs and values. Right? You accept or reject certain beliefs and values. You think it through. You see if the beliefs really hold up to reason. And only if you do that can you really see if the beliefs are valuable. This is an incredibly important tool, because so many beliefs that are imparted to us can be harmful to ourselves or cause us to harm others, as some of the beliefs I just mentioned. Right? Yeah, you can be raised with extremely destructive beliefs that come from your family or your community, beliefs that are destructive towards yourselves, beliefs that are destructive towards others. There's the idea, right? There's the problem. So the way out of this is really quite simple. You think it through, you test the beliefs and see if they hold up to reason. And so Socrates, that's what he does. He comes up with a test to see how beliefs and values do. Do they pass this test? How does this test work? Here you go. So this is called the Socratic method. And the Socratic method is very famous. There are different ways you could explain the Socratic method. And it could work in a number of ways. But here's a 5-step version of it. I saw this in some textbook at some point in time. I forget where, but I frequently taught it this way since then. So what you do is you're in a conversation, right? Somebody's talking about an issue that's important, and you then pose a question about that issue to the person. You say, what is X? So somebody's saying, I'm glad they're going to punish that criminal. That's justice. And so you say something, really, what is justice? And Socrates will want the answer. Socrates will want the answer to be an essential definition. And what I mean by an essential definition is like a dictionary definition. It tells you what the thing is. So he doesn't want a list. He doesn't want an example. He wants you to get the essence of the thing. So you want to say something like, well, justice is giving people what they deserve, right? That kind of definition. And he says, okay, great. And then he tries to find a counter example to that immediately. So giving people what they deserve. And then he raises an objection, right? He finds a counter example. And then what the counter example does is shows that the definition doesn't quite get it right. It's either false, not maybe entirely, but at least partially, or incomplete. It's missing something. So then you and Socrates, this is always a dialogue. You do a dialogue with yourself, but ideally it was with other people. You change the definition for the counter example to work. So you change, you say, okay, I guess that's not quite right. And then you change the definition to account for the counter example. And you do this 2 through 4 as long as you can. You keep coming up with a counter example changing the definition, new counterexample, changing the definition, because the definition is changed to take the counterexample into account. So you do that as long as possible. And I'll give you kind of a silly example. Suppose Socrates went to the zoo, and I don't know, he's new to this. So he sees that there are some animals at the zoo called mammals. And so he asked us, we take Socrates to the zoo, and he says, what is a mammal? And I give him a terrible definition. I say, well, a mammal is any animal that lives on the land. That's obviously a terrible definition. It's the right kind of definition. It's an essential definition. I gave him a kind of definition that would say, hey, these ones are in, these ones are out. But it's not a good definition for obvious reasons. And he says, what about those lizards over there? And I say, oh yeah, they live on the land, but they're not mammals, are they? Oh yeah, I forgot about lizards. So I revise it, right? I say any animal that lives on land and has body hair. Any animal that lives on land and has body hair. And he says, oh, but what about those seals over there? And I think about marine mammals, seals and sea lions and whales and dolphins. And I keep thinking about it. What do they do? Well, they all breathe air. And this goes on, and I think about live birth, and I think about nursing their young. And eventually, I think this is from Webster's dictionary where I looked this up. I say, a mammal is a warm-blooded vertebrate animal of a class that is distinguished by the possession of hair or fur, the secretion of milk by females for the nourishment of young, and typically the birth of live young. Now you have to say typically the birth of live young. You have to think of like the duck-billed platypus. This is a strange mammal, but it apparently still counts. And that's a definition that Socrates might say, you know what, that works pretty well. We'll kind of accept it for now, unless we have reason to change it later. And that's kind of the best you can do with a definition. And that's kind of how that works for Socrates. So interesting move there. And that's what you can do. It's hard to get that far with ethical definitions, although maybe you could. But you have to be able to do that well, and it's a long process. And often you really just can't get there. And so that's what Socrates is trying to drive at. It's hard. And you really should do that with your beliefs, your values, your ethical beliefs. That's his method. Well, he explains most of this at his trial. He doesn't go to the steps of his method, but he gives you the idea. And he defends himself pretty well against the charges. He really shouldn't be charged with anything, but he is found guilty. He is sentenced to death. 6 months later or so, the hemlock arrives after he's been in prison, and he does take the hemlock. It's a poison that he has to self-administer to take his life, and he does die. He is presented as very calm in the face of death. Very much undisturbed by it, perhaps even happy that it's ended this way, for the simple reason that Socrates refuses to change himself. You get this whole idea that the court would let him go, at least not give him death, if he agreed to stop being Socrates and stop acting the way he would act, and he won't do that. He'd rather die than change who he is. Death, in fact, he doesn't think to be something fearful. He just says, look, death is either the end of us, in which we're not around to worry about it, or death is paradise. If you're a good person, it's paradise or the end of us. And neither of those options is bad or scary or harmful. So death isn't bad or scary or harmful. What would be bad or scary or harmful if I stopped being true to myself? And I won't do that. And he's very convinced by this. And so he's unafraid of death. And he drinks the hemlock, and he does die. And that is the end of Socrates. Now, there's a whole lot more, obviously, one could say about Socrates, but it does seem like this is a pretty good introduction to the guy. So this is a good place to start when you start philosophy. And we'll stop with that for today. Thank you.